everyone, and thank you so much for tuning into the BPD Bravery Show. On today's podcast, we have Jesse Finkelstein, a doctoral student in clinical psychology and a DBT therapist. His research interests include DBT and the dissemination of therapeutic interventions, especially for sexual and gender minorities. We discuss distress tolerance, emotion dysregulation, and so much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
Hi, and welcome to the BPD Bravery Show, where we discuss tips, strategies, struggles, triumphs, and success stories related to borderline personality disorder. Here is your host, Faye Green.
Your question was, what is my specialty? I think of firstly, I will say that the treatment that I am most interested, that has had the most profound effect in my life, and that I have found to be effective for a lot of sort of complex sort of disorders, is dialectical behavior therapy. And so, DBT was created for folks who engage in or experience intense emotion dysregulation. And oftentimes that fits within the category of borderline personality disorder. That being said, I don't know how much I sort of subscribe or sort of believe in personality disorders broadly. I have my own sort of opinions about personality disorders. So I would never sort of think of myself as someone who specializes in personality disorders. I think of myself as someone who's interested in working with folks who are experiencing intense suffering.
I like that. I like how you put it. That's well said.
I guess. I don't know. Was it?
Yeah, because I'm not sure why you don't like the word personality disorders, but I've got my issues with it too.
What are your issues with it?
Well, a personality is a personality. Now, if you make it a disorder, you're kind of, at least for me in the beginning, now I've changed my mind about it. Like I view it as a different thing, but like it was like, oh, this is my personality. Like I can't change it. I can't be helped. Like this is who I am, which I felt was just discouraging. That's just how it worked for me. It was like, this is who I am. This is my person. If you're telling me that the way I perceive the world and the way I feel things is my personality, and it's bad, it's a disorder, right? Disorder is not something that we want. It made me feel I associated with a lot of hopelessness.
I completely agree, and I think that's one of the reasons why I take issue with it. I also take issue with it because I don't really feel like it's a terribly accurate description of our experience. So, when we think of personality, we think of something that's kind of fixed, that right. Like, this is who I am. And I don't believe such a thing exists. I think that we are constantly changing. I think that the way that we behave is different depending on the context, depending on who we're interacting with. I think that you could probably observe patterns in behavior, and that's not a personality. So I just don't think I don't think personality is a very descriptive way of describing a person's experience. I think it's a very limited idea. How I'm being with you right now isn't necessarily how I'm going to appear or act when I'm at work or when I'm, doing something else. And I think to your other point, like the danger of calling something a personality disorder is then you're taking this idea of this fixed thing, this idea that this is who someone is, and somehow it's disordered. And I think that's incredibly pathologizing. I think it's incredibly fucked up, and I don't think it's real.
What about the emotional
dysregulation?
Yeah, something like that. I know people, and I have an even bigger issue with that.
I'm curious about what is your issue with that?
I don't know, because I know it's emotional unstable EUPD. What does that
Well,
stand for?
I have not heard of.
Emotional unstable personality. They call that, I think, in England. I've heard people in
So,
London call that way, EUPD. And the unstable is what just gets at me.
yeah, these
Not
are
saying that I'm always that okay, like my emotions are, wishy-washy, yeah. But just saying that they're just labeling something unstable for
it,
me is a
it's
problem.
pejorative. I like it at the and I think this goes back to sort of my training in DBT and how it's informed how I think about any given disorder or experience. Like again, nothing is good or bad. It's just if it's in line with your goals or if it's not, if it's effective or it's not effective. Also, describing something unstable is again not terribly like I don't know what that means. It's not terribly behaviorally specific. Like I just don't know what does instability mean?
I think it's referring to like sometimes people with BPD could like be super happy. Like it's not like manic, but it's like very happy for a few minutes or a few hours. And then there's like that massive dip of from there, a person could go to like being super sad or,
I mean, that to me
suicidal.
sounds more specific than unstable. Like I have a clearer picture in my mind of what that means, but unstable and also it's going to look different from person to person. So if I had to land on one, I think dysregulation is is perhaps in many ways the most accurate because what's happening a lot of times when we talk about emotion dysregulation is that folks haven't necessarily learned the skills to either sort of downregulate their emotional intensity or it's sometimes upregulated. And so it's really a skills deficit of managing the intensity, the duration of one's emotional experience.
If I were to ask you, what is the definition of emotion regulation and how does it tie into the idea of people with BPD um, having an issue with it? Well, how
Mhm.
would you explain that?
It's a wonderful question. So in DBT, we have something that we call the biosocial theory. And it's the way that Marshall Linehan, who developed DBT, uses to sort of conceptualize how folks develop intense emotional dysregulation that's oftentimes accompanied by, let's say, ineffective behaviors to regulate those emotions. So the biosocial theory holds that there's sort of these two transactional elements. There is at times perhaps a biological sensitivity, emotional vulnerability. And what that's understood as certain folks are born with an emotional vulnerability whereby they experience emotions perhaps more intensely for longer durations, and it takes longer and more frequently than perhaps other folks. Now, that alone isn't necessarily enough to cause folks, for instance, to develop BPD, quote unquote. It's when that emotional vulnerability transacts with an invalidating environment, with an environment that communicates to that person that somehow their emotions are wrong, that they're bad. And so folks will oftentimes then engage in, then all of a sudden emotions become something to be feared, or emotions cue intense feelings of shame. And then people will try to find all sorts of ways to either avoid those intense emotions or when they experience those intense emotions, sort of at times punish themselves. And so that's
Wait a
how it's
second, Fluffy.
conceptualized.
Oops. Okay, Fluff.
This
Come
is
here.
this so Fluffy is having their own
Oh,
experience of intense emotional arousal and having difficulty regulating that intense emotional arousal.
oh gosh, is that
If dogs
because
have emotions, which I don't know if they do or not.
I think I mean, But does that mean that he's an invalidating? Because my fear is that I'm always messing him up. Um, I have this fear of like because of what I'm going through, I'm messing up his life. So now I'm starting to
What
think
does
I'm
it
giving
mean
him
to
BP.
mess up his life? Like in what way would his life be messed up?
Um, like if he sees me cry, right? I mean,
Okay.
a dog doesn't want their owner to cry. They
How do,
probably want.
how do you know that?
I don't. You're right, but I feel so guilty because like like if he sees me not doing well, he'll just come up to me and like just hold on to me and like or like sit in my lap, and it's like I'm supposed to be there for you, not the other way around, right?
Well, I didn't realize that there were rules about having pets. I didn't even realize that pets had a conceptualization of being there for their owner. So I guess I mean, but what you're describing is kind of what happens when we are told that somehow expressing our emotions is going to be burdensome, that is somehow wrong, it's gonna make the lives of those around us somehow worse. And you know what can happen if we really follow those thoughts down is that then we become very afraid of experiencing emotions. Then any emotion becomes a cue for us, maybe the thought like, oh, I'm bad for having this, or my emotions are destructive, so I have to do all sorts of things to not feel. When in fact, when we allow ourselves to just experience our emotion without pushing it away or holding on to them, emotions don't tend to last for very long.
For me, it does. Well, breakup. Sorry. Abandonment issues, massive abandonment. When it comes to anything associated with abandonment,
Hmm.
those things tend to last like so freaking long.
So here I think there's two ways of looking at this, right? The emotional experience, like the arousal, what's happening physiologically in your body when you feel something, that experience is not terribly long lasting. But what ends up perpetuating it is how we think about that emotion, how we think about the situation. So our thoughts end up sort of at times lengthening that emotional experience, perhaps intensifying that emotional experience. And there is this biological component that some people have that perhaps their emotional experience is that much more intense and longer lasting. So I think there's two truths to this. I hope what I'm saying is making sense right now.
Yeah, yeah, definitely is. I'm just thinking about my life and how messed up I am.
Well, then again, that's just notice the negative self judgment. None of it, like it's just a thought, like messed up. Like we are all doing the best that we can. Like life is fucking hard.
It is,
It
isn't
is
it?
hard. It is hard to get through this, and like it. It's been hard. I'm sure throughout history. It feels right now like I don't know. All of that's to say is that we are all truly doing the best that we can, given what we know, given our biology, given the skills that we have available to us.
So I want to go back to motion regulation because
Yeah.
I love the story with Bambi and I want to hear it from
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
So it's like the story with Bambi was like, hold on, two kids
Hmm.
born to the same parents. Why does someone develop, say, BPD or whatever you want to call it?
Yeah.
And why does someone have an easier time regulating the emotion versus their sister or their twin or whoever,
Hmm.
their sibling?
Yeah.
Let's get to that because I love that
Yeah.
story.
Sure. So okay. So to recap for folks, so basically the example that I will often use is you're watching the movie Bambi. Spoiler alert: Bambi's mother gets shot and dies.
Oh,
You've got two kids sitting next to you, right? Both of them start to cry, and then let's say the one on the left, like begins to self calm and then comes back to the movie. The one on the right continues to cry. And you turn to that child and you say, oh, it's okay, it's just a movie. And then the child continues to cry. And then you're like, it's going to be fine. It's just a movie. And the child continues to cry. And so what do you do as the child continues to cry?
Enough. Okay, we've cried enough. Okay,
Yeah.
just stop it. Just stop this thing.
It's like okay, like it all of a sudden we start getting, many folks, not everyone, will start getting frustrated and we'll be like, okay, that's enough. And so what happens is that kid on the right, they're receiving the message, and it makes sense. Like, I'm not trying to blame the parent or what have you, because we're not necessarily, all of us, very skilled at helping other people manage their regulate their emotions or validate their emotional experience. And oftentimes when kids with intense emotions are, grow up, they're oftentimes met with, okay, cut it out, like, stop being such a baby, your emotions are too much. And so, oftentimes one or two things will happen. That kid will get the message that their emotional experience is somehow wrong. What's wrong with me for crying so much? Are my emotions bad? And so the next time they experience an intense emotion, it may be coupled with the thought, oh, I'm bad for experiencing this so intensely. And what we know is that when you start tying, let's say, a feeling like sadness and then start including shame on top of it, well, now you're just intensifying more negative emotion, and it becomes a cycle.
But the question though is, now I don't have kids, but like, what is this parent say watching those two kids and one can't stop? What do you like?
What do you
Is there
do?
a way to react to that child?
I think that there are a number of things you could do. I think the first thing is, again, if our goal is not to give the message that that child is wrong for feeling what they're feeling, perhaps you could help them validate what their emotion is. Like, like, this is really scary. It's really sad what happened to Bambi Mom. I hear you. I see you right now, and I understand how sad you are. Perhaps it is, like, I recognize how sad you are in this moment. Maybe we can practice some skills to help reduce the intensity of this emotion right now.
Which would be?
So in DBT, we have 4 modules of skills. When I'm thinking about, like, let's say our emotional intensity is at an 8, 9, or 10. Like, we're at just like, oh, we're boiling over. Then we tend to sort of use a set of skills called distress tolerance. And distress tolerance skills include skills like the tip skills, which you maybe seen on, like, TikTok and so forth, where what we're actually doing is bringing down our quote unquote physiological temperature. So we're feeling less aroused, less overwhelmed. And we could do that through breathing exercises, paced breathing. We can do that through something called tipping the temperature, sort of putting our face in some cold water, which then sort of lowers our heart rate. We can do that through paired muscle relaxation. We can do that through a brief spurt of intense exercise. All of that has the effect of reducing the intensity of our physiological experience, which thereby reduces the intensity of our emotional experience. Or it could be something like distraction, with a set of skills called Wise Mind Accepts. It's an acronym, and so you could use a distraction method, like, okay, let's leave Bambi for a second. Why don't we go into the kitchen and taste some chocolate and begin to really put our attention there, so we're not necessarily focusing on this other experience. And then when that child is a bit more regulated, maybe when they're at like a 7, 6, or 5, you can have a conversation about, okay, does your emotions fit the facts? So checking the facts of the situation. Like, I understand you're sad right now. And does your emotion fit the facts of the situation? Yes. Okay. Sadness makes sense. Does the intensity of your sadness make sense? All right, maybe not. So maybe we'll use some opposite action. Why don't we go back into the room and behave, engage, interested in the movie, and perhaps less sad. So that's in my mind, like how I run through some of the DBT skills and how I would use them.
So the last one would be checking the facts, right?
So checking the facts, opposite action are two skills within the emotion regulation module. And checking the facts is you're looking at the situation, you're asking yourself, does the intent, like, firstly, does my emotion fit the facts of this situation? Does my sadness, my anger, my shame, what have you? And you're not just asking if it fits the facts of the situation, you're also asking, does the duration and intensity of my emotion fit the facts? So like with the kid with Bambi, if the kid is at a 10 out of 10 on sadness, think in terms of the intensity of his sadness or her sadness or their sadness, I think we can all agree that that wouldn't fit the facts. So the question is, how do we then help that kid perhaps engage in something called opposite action to behave in a way that actually is more in line with a, I don't want to say the word normal, but normative way of experiencing this. And what we know is that when we behave a certain way, that tends to impact how we feel.
And I've heard, and I'm not sure, I didn't verify this, but I've heard that in New York City, they're teaching DBT in schools to kids in some schools. Is that true or not? I know that I've heard it from someone in Long Island.
I know that there are certain programs that are currently taking place. I don't know if in all schools they're doing it. And like, I think that's a brilliant idea. Go ahead. What is your thought?
I'm not sure if I know that like mindfulness is something they're trying to incorporate, and I don't know, but I know that I'm not sure of every part of DBT, and I'm pretty sure not every part of DBT. It's probably too much for teachers to learn everything, or I'm not sure if they're hiring professionals to do that, or if they're teaching the teachers. I don't know how it's working.
Yeah, I think like I know that that there's a practice called CBC, which is run by Alec Miller, who helped develop the DBTA treatment for DBT for adolescents. They've been working on an like a school-based intervention. I think that and this is, based on my experience with DBT, like at the root of all suffering is sort of emotional avoidance, in my opinion. When we try to avoid or an escape an emotion, that causes us suffering. Pain is inevitable. We're all going to experience pain. We're all going to experience sadness. We're all going to experience hurt, fear, etc. But when we are preoccupied with not experiencing, with avoiding it, pretending it doesn't exist, numbing ourselves to it, that's what causes us suffering. And I think, I know if I were a child, I think that all kids could use this, and I see this with the kids that I work with, that if they could arrive with an understanding that their emotions aren't bad, that their emotions are not going to destroy them, that they can experience things without getting completely overwhelmed by it, then I think their experience of suffering would be that much less.
Yeah, the only problem is if they go home and their parents are like, because like growing up, we're not allowed to show emotions, or, like that was something that was not allowed. So say this child learns that, but then goes home and the mom would say, cut the crap out, like.
Yeah, I mean, this is, but at the very least, they're hearing it someplace else, that their emotions are not bad. Like, you're right. Like, it's inevitable that they're going to have experiences in other environments where they're like, and it doesn't even have to be one's family. Like, there's a reason why many folks who are sexual and gender minorities oftentimes are at some point given the diagnosis of BPD or engage in suicidal, non-suicidal self-interest behaviors. Because this sort of invalidating environment, the invalidating environment that communicates that somehow you are wrong, your emotions are wrong, that can exist at a cultural level or a political level. So we're always going to get to varying degrees that somehow we or our emotions are wrong. I think that one of the most impactful things that we can do, at least in schools, is begin to educate kids that, in fact, who gives a shit about what all those other people say? No, you are exactly as you're supposed to be.
So which age group do you work with? Is it kids mostly, or?
So I actually work with kids and adults. So, ranging from like 11 all the way up to folks who are in their late 60s.
And how does a kid end up receiving DBT, right?
It's a good question. So where I currently work, I'm not necessarily offering those kids comprehensive DBT. And I have worked in DBT adolescent clinics where I am doing, and that's typically 13 to I believe it was like 13 to 20 to 21. Anyway, how do kids end up receiving DBT?
Like what brings them in? Like, how do they end up getting therapy even?
How do they end up getting therapy?
Because I'm thinking if their family is like, just think, if a family is invalidating and believes,
No.
okay, there is nothing wrong with you, don't show emotions, how do they decide, okay, this kid really needs treatment? Or how do they end up there?
That's a wonderful question.
Family's so invalidating. It's just
Yeah, and here's the thing, like I don't like invalidation exists on a continuum, and it can be expressed in all sorts of ways. Invalidation can look like ignoring. Invalidation can look like physical abuse. Invalidation can look like neglect. And invalidation also, it's like we are all, the reality is, in ways invalidating one another at times. So even parents with the best of intentions will probably in some way invalidate their kid. So I think for the folks who I see, the kids that I see, they have engaged in really at times, I guess, what I like, you could describe as sort of alarming behaviors, like either it's been threats of suicide, it's been self-harm, it's been like perhaps like behavioral dysregulation at school, maybe hitting kids. So perhaps they've been recommended by their teachers, their parents clearly see their child as suffering. Now they might not have the same sort of conceptualization around emotions that I do, and they still want to help their kid. Again, like every parent that I've met, like no matter whether or not they feel like their kid's emotions are right or wrong, wants to see their child in pain.
That's true.
So it's just about how they conceptualize what's causing that pain.
Yeah. Do you think that, now I'm not sure that this is a fact, do you think that the older generations are less likely to engage in therapy or go to therapy or try to get help? Kind of say that there is a problem, or that they have a problem, or there is a problem in the family, like as far as mental illness?
That's an interesting question. I'm sure there is plenty of data that looks at like help seeking or therapy seeking at different age groups. So I don't know offhand. It's certainly just anecdotally, and I think, there's probably some, I feel like this younger generation, Gen Z, seems to be, there's so much more conversation around mental health. And I think that's probably partly due to the pandemic and the sort of exponential rise in mental health disorders amongst sort of young kids, teens, adolescents that we've seen. So I think that there's a greater willingness to talk about mental health than there has been in previous generations.
What what age is Gen Z?
The age is Gen Z.
Like when I don't I can't keep up with
I
this.
can't keep up with it either. I know that they're younger than I am. I mean, like, like they're, aren't they? They're like in their early 20s and so forth. And then,
Ah,
yeah.
so there's Gen Z, there's Gen Y. No, did I just make that up? Gen X, XYZ.
There's Gen X. Wait, are millennials Gen Y? You know what? And the young kids is what we're talking about. Whatever generation is, are the young ones.
I think that's important though, like, because I feel, and this is my theory, that the younger you are when you start getting the help, the quote unquote more mentally healthy, like emotionally healthy you'll be as an adult.
Yeah.
No? Or am I totally making this?
No.
Thinking...
I completely, I absolutely, like, again, it is all about, in my mind, skills. The earlier you, like, firstly, we know that young minds are far more sort of like elastic and flexible. And the earlier that we can reach out to kids and get them to practice, to metabolize, to learn these skills for sort of effective emotional experiencing, yeah, that's going to help them throughout their lives. And it's only going to grow if they continue to practice those skills. So yeah, yes, I believe that too.
And how long does a person do the DBT? I mean, learn it. Say, I mean, I know there are programs like group programs. Some people do it one-on-one. I've heard from 12 weeks to 2 years. What do you say the general time frame of
DBT looks like? So I'll break down the different types of ways a person can typically do DBT. So the comprehensive DBT, as it was created, has essentially 4 components. It has individual therapy, group skills group, which meets once a week for about 2 hours. Then there is phone coaching, so that those clients can receive on-demand phone coaching.
Damn, that's great. Okay.
It is, and the logic behind that is, and I think this is brilliant. I think that this is how all therapy should, not a great word, but I think it can be very effective. Is that what we're trying to do is get folks to generalize those skills. It's like, it's one thing to teach someone a skill in a 2-hour block when they're focused and in class, so to speak. But then to actually have a person practice and implement those skills when they're actually in their life, when they need it, like, that's where the magic's going to happen. So that's partly the logic behind the phone coaching. And then there is something called team, which is a sort of colloquially understood like this therapy for the therapists. It's a way for therapists who are delivering DBT to get together and problem solve, receive validation, case formulate, all that sort of stuff. So that's comprehensive DBT. And that's been the most studied variation. Comprehensive DBT, so DBT is typically structured around the teaching of the modules. It takes around 6 months to get through all 4. Some clinics will offer a 6-month dose. Other clinics will offer a year-long dose. So you go through each module twice.
Oh, that's good.
And so that's why the year-long one. The research tends to indicate that there aren't necessarily huge difference of effects between 6 months and a year. So I don't know. The clinic where I learned DBT, we did a 6-month dose. It was incredibly powerful, and I could see advantages for a year. Now, there has been a lot of research on standalone DBT skills group. So absent of therapy, absent of phone coaching, this is you come in once a week for 2 hours and you learn the skills. And that also has been shown to be effective. So there are different ways. Now, there is another way where folks can receive like DBT informed therapy. So they'll come in, they'll meet with, like, let's say someone who's been trained in DBT and receive maybe some sort of individual therapy without the group, without the phone coaching. I don't think that there's been necessarily a ton of study on the effectiveness of that type of intervention. So I think it's just something to be mindful of and to talk to your therapist about. If that is something that, you know, if you are interested in DBT, then that might not be the comprehensive DBT you're thinking of. Still can be,
you might want to go.
but you want to.
Yeah, you might want to go the 4. What do you call it? The 4 team. The 4
sort of components, or like it. You know, it depends on sort of like perhaps the intensity or severity of what you're experiencing. I will say that one way, and I forget who mentioned this, but I think one measure of whether or not you're seeing a quote unquote compliant DBT clinician, or one thing to ask, is whether or not that clinician is part of a DBT team.
Oh, I see. Because then, all right. Because even if, say, they think that X, Y, Z is the right thing, right? Let's do X. But then when you talk about it with other people, you might come up with better ideas. You might get more insight. That's a cool part, because that's got nothing to do with a patient, right? With a person.
I mean, it has nothing and everything in a way, because like now the patient gets the benefit of having an entire team of therapists.
That is so
sort of help, you know, that therapist sort of work through what's going to be most effective for that patient.
That is so smart.
Yeah, it's amazing.
That is so smart. Now all you got to do is come up with the money if you don't have insurance.
I mean, this has been a big struggle. And I mean, you know, you mentioned TheraHive, like there are a number of obstacles in terms of delivering and disseminating DBT. One of them is that it can be very expensive.
Oh yeah.
There are few programs that offer comprehensive DBT with insurance. It's a very tough, because there's so many elements that go into it. It's just a very expensive proposition. So
let's hear. So you mentioned TheraHive. So how does?
Yeah. So TheraHive is a company that I co-founded along with Dr. Alicia Smart, who runs a comprehensive DBT clinic in San Francisco, and Marin. And basically our goal is to create a sort of hybrid DBT skills group, where the learning of the skills will be self-guided. You will go through sort of our platform, you will see like the different types of skills, and you'll learn all this sort of stuff. And then you'll be part of a weekly homework review group, which will give you an opportunity to sort of discuss how you've used those skills and get clarification. And the idea is that we're making it sort of more accessible, time-friendly, and we're reducing the time commitment on behalf of clinicians, or not even clinicians, it can be done by coaches, whomever, by half. So rather than 2 hours, it's a 1-hour commitment. So anything that we can do to sort of help figure out ways of reducing the cost and the burden so that we can increase access. That is
so important. Thank you for doing that, because I mean, I know a lot of people with BPD who just can't get the help because they just don't have the money.
It is, I think, one of the most painful realities of living in this country, that evidence-based interventions and resources like these are not freely accessible. I mean that, along with healthcare, it's unconscionable.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't even have medical insurance, so I can't afford that. So you just gotta hope that you don't get sick, and I I did learn DBT many years ago. I learned it one on I think it was the what you mentioned, the therapy based DBT.
Yeah. Okay.
So I haven't learned everything. I've also heard that since that was like 13, 14 years ago, they've updated a lot. They've added a lot too. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe I didn't learn everything. The only problem was that like after I finished learning it, and at the time it was so helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But then I stopped practicing the whatever I learned, and it just I still have some sheets, papers, I look back on it and let's say tips
Yeah.
that I remember. There are other things like Dear Man, which is like very like faded. Some I remember, some I don't. And then I could look at a sheet and I'm like, I have no idea how to incorporate this. I just don't. I know that I need the help. And I'm like, okay, maybe the next sheet or maybe the next sheet. But like if you don't practice it for so many years, it just
It's like anything. It's like any skill. It's like if you don't make it part of your routine, you're not going to think to use it,
no.
and then it's not going to become part of your repertoire. And
No.
so, like, I think, there are sort of graduate skills groups. I think that those need to be more widely available. There are things that I think maybe that will probably come on the horizon, like a more sort of user-friendly sort of DBT skills book, which I think would be really valuable. So yeah.
Thanks for doing this. Thanks for the TheraHive. And I know you also published a game, right?
Yes, the
Just
game.
still, I have to get that game because it sounds really fun.
Oh, I'll send you over a copy.
Do you have to know? Do you have to know the DBT skills to do that game?
Um, not necessarily. I tried to make it as sort of user friendly as possible, so that even for people who don't know DBT, they can at least get a taste of what the skills are about.
Oh,
So I think of it as two ways. One, it's a way for people who do know DBT to sort of get an opportunity to practice it, and then as for folks who don't know it, to be like a nice introduction. Like this is what it looks like.
thank you so much for helping us.
I don't.
We need people like you.
We're like, again, it's like we're all suffering. We just need skills to help manage our suffering and reduce it.
You're so right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's BPD Bravery Show. If you've enjoyed it, then like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure to tune into our show every Monday and Friday. And remember, you are so much more than your BPD.